Welcome to the video about bacterial toxins. And in this video, what I hope to do is give you a clearer idea of what goes on in some bacterial diseases. In particular, I've chosen 4 or 5 bacterial diseases where all of the signs and symptoms are caused by a single protein or 2 or 3 proteins released at the same time. So these are proteins the bacteria release and they cause the disease. This can happen in several different ways and it can affect various different parts of the body in different ways, so let's get into it. First, some definitions. You will remember endotoxin. Make sure you remember where that is and why we care about it and what it does to the human body. It is named endotoxin because it is an intrinsic part of a bacterial cell, as opposed to exotoxins, which are made by bacteria and intentionally released from bacteria. Okay, so exotoxins often are going to be proteins that are going to be released intentionally by the bacteria. And so a common kind of exotoxin is an enterotoxin, and I think you might guess what that is just from the name. Entero typically refers to the small intestine, and so these are exotoxins that work against intestinal cells, usually epithelial cells in the small intestine. So the first disease is tetanus, and this is caused by a protein, this protein exotoxin. And you could philosophically say the disease is actually caused by the bacterium that makes the toxin, and that's also fine. You just have to understand where the signs and symptoms come from. So for Clostridium tetani, which is the bacterium that makes tetanus, Clostridium tetani is an endospore former, so it's very stable in the environment, and it's an obligate anaerobe, so it will only germinate in an environment with low oxygen, such as a deep puncture wound. Once it germinates and there are vegetative cells that can start growing, they will release the tetanus toxin. And this goes through a complicated series of steps in the human body where it gets moved through the blood and lymph and eventually into a neuron, and then it gets sent through the neuron to a certain place where it can inhibit the signals that would normally inhibit muscle contraction. So it is blocking inhibitory nerve impulses. And what that leads to is uncontrollable muscle contraction. It leads to uncontrollable muscle spasms. And so this is lockjaw. A person would not be able to unclench their jaw. Some people would be unable to flex or unflex their back. And ultimately, a person will be unable to relax their diaphragm, and that causes death through asphyxiation. So tetanus is a very dangerous disease, but all of it happens because this one protein interferes with those nerve signals. The next disease is actually 2 diseases. That's why I say 4 or 5. They're both caused by Bacillus cereus. And I will go through them a little bit separately, but this bacterium, Bacillus cereus, is an endospore former. Not all strains are obligate anaerobes. Some are facultative anaerobes. But what many of them can do is grow on food. And if they grow on starchy foods like rice or noodles, they tend to release a heat-stable exotoxin. And this exotoxin affects the epithelia in the stomach and leads to vomiting. So this is called the emetic food poisoning. And then the other version is if the cells grow on other foods, they're more likely to sporulate and then be eaten as endospores and then germinate in the intestines and release a different protein exotoxin that causes a diarrheal syndrome. So here's some key terminology just to make sure we're on the same page. An infection is a situation where microorganisms grow in or on the body, and it's not always a bad thing. Probiotics are supposed to infect us. It doesn't mean a disease. Disease is a separate thing. An intestinal infection means microbes are growing in the intestines. usually the small intestine, and usually that is a bad thing. An intestinal infection of the small intestine usually is part of a disease. But an infection of the colon, that's where we want the bacteria to be, so that's usually an infection that is not part of a disease. So if food poisoning is this unique thing where the bacteria only have to grow outside the body and make a toxin there outside, and then we eat the toxin, and that toxin alone causes the disease. In the case of food poisoning, it doesn't matter if the bacteria even survive going through the stomach. Even if the bacteria are all dead, if that toxin makes it through, if the toxin gets to where it can act, it will cause the disease, regardless of whether any living cells are present with it. So food poisoning really is a type of poisoning, and it doesn't involve an infection necessarily. This is a slide about the emetic form of the disease, or the vomiting one, and this is the toxin. It's made of amino acids, but it is not technically, it's not a protein like what we normally think of. It's not made by a ribosome. It's made by a different system, and it doesn't have a complex three-dimensional folding that can be undone by heat. So this survives cooking. And that's why we can get food poisoning from it, because if this is in the food and we eat the food, we get the food poisoning. Whether or not the cells survive the cooking, if this survived the cooking, we end up vomiting. And then the other one from Bacillus cereus is a diarrheal toxin. And this, my understanding, and our understanding of this has changed over time. This is not food poisoning. This is caused by an intestinal infection where the bacteria get through the stomach, they're eaten, and if they are in the form of endospores, they will pass through the stomach, and some of them will survive and then germinate in the small intestine, and there they will release the toxin, and that toxin will cause the epithelial cells to release water, and that is what diarrhea comes from. Sometimes that's a major cause of diarrhea, especially really, really severe diarrhea when the small intestine is involved. A much more severe diarrhea is cholera, and cholera is a disease caused by an intestinal infection by these bacteria, Vibrio cholerae. They mostly die in the stomach, but if you drink enough of them, some of them get through, and in the intestine they grow and release a protein toxin called the cholera toxin. And what that toxin does is kind of similar to what the diarrheal toxin from Bacillus cereus did. It reprograms the activities of epithelial cells in the small intestine, and those cells end up pumping water into the lumen of the small intestine. Instead of absorbing it, they release it. That can cause severe diarrhea, which in turn can cause severe dehydration. And a bad case of cholera can rapidly kill a person, I believe in 48 hours. This also explains why you can save a person's life if they have cholera by giving them oral rehydration. So measuring how much diarrhea comes out and giving them that much of an electrolyte sugar solution to replace the fluids and give them the electrolytes back. So cholera is horrible. Another horrible, very different thing is toxic shock syndrome. And this is a disease, again, caused by an exotoxin. A lot of bacteria can cause versions of this, but Staphylococcus aureus is the most common. And its toxic shock syndrome toxin is pretty well understood. So when Staphylococcus aureus grows in the body or just outside the body, like in a nasal pack or a superabsorbent tampon, in some cases, for reasons we don't understand, it releases the toxic shock syndrome toxin. And what that does is circulate through the body until it finds T cells. And this toxin basically connects T cell receptors to the major histocompatibility complex 2. So if a dendritic cell is trying to activate a T cell, showing it an antigen, if this toxin is there, it will make the T cell activate whether it recognizes that antigen or not. So this causes indiscriminate activation of many T cells, and that leads to, death of tissues, like a person's skin will basically fall off, but also their blood pressure will eventually drop to deadly levels. And other things. And so we will come back to all but one of these diseases in Unit 4, and we'll look at them more in terms of risk factors, prevention, some treatments, things like that. But for now, make sure you can name these, name the major signs. Is it vomiting? Is it paralysis? What happens? Is it fatal? So what's the outcome? Is it fatal? Do people typically recover in a few days? And what is the major risk factor? Is it eating contaminated food, or a puncture wound, or drinking heavily contaminated water? That's the risk factor for cholera. People have to drink obscene amounts of these bacteria to get sick, which tells you something about the world. So that's all for now. Have a great day.